just want to introduce you. David is a British expert in the banking and financial sectors with an extensive knowledge of European economies. Currently, it's impressive what you are doing. He's a business consultant for large organizations, still a journalist and writer on political, economic, and monetary issues. He is also a visiting professor at Sheffield University Department of Politics and at King's College London Policy Institute. And finally, he's the chairman of the OMFIF, which is the official monetary and financial institution forum. So in a word, I think he was right with such a career and such an experience. He was the right person to share with us his views on the potential impacts of the fast rising inflation on the international economies, exchanges, and more specifically, the role that national and supranational institutions could play in these concepts. So to be fast and let you talk and let you share your views, I will have two questions. First, what is the biggest challenges you have identified for 2022 and 2023 for governments as well as for private sector in Europe and worldwide? And currently, do you believe that the economy of those countries, like France, like UK, I would say, I would say they are good performers, but are they not overeating as well? That's my first question. And second point, are you skeptical on the way the Eurozone will perform and react to this inflation context? Do you believe that European Central Bank and the Bank of England will coordinate to solve this crisis, and how they can succeed? Up to you, David.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Françoise, and very pleased to be here. Just on your question about the challenges, there's a long list. Because of overnight events in Ukraine, where it looks as though we do have the beginning of an invasion, that clearly has to be the number one uncertainty right now, and the effect of that, not just on energy prices, but on the whole European economy. Germany is a place that will be particularly hit because they will bring in sanctions now, which will affect a huge swathe of German industry. Germany has a lot of exports to Russia, and as everybody knows, they are very dependent also on Russian gas. I should imagine that this will strike a very strong psychological chord with Germany, which somewhat irrationally has been hoping for a peaceful solution in the Ukraine. It doesn't look as though that's likely to happen. So that's number one, I would say. I would point out also that the presidential election in France is still not a foregone conclusion, although it does look as though Monsieur Macron will win. And no doubt the Ukraine crisis will help Macron, I would imagine. So we may have some stability on that front. But I would also turn to Italy and wonder what the future of Italy will be, whether Mr. Draghi will carry on in a relatively unperturbed way as prime minister, at least for a year, and whether there could be some more hazards when we come round to a general election, which has to be held at the latest in spring of 2023. And then let's look at China and the United States. You don't need me to go into all the things that could go wrong there. There's a long list, but Ukraine certainly tops it all.
Yes.
On the issue about Britain and France, I don't think we can talk about overheating because we've had this monumental slowdown in 2020. Both countries have done quite well, better than Germany actually, in recovering in 2021. France has been holding down energy prices for political reasons ahead of the elections, which means the inflation rate in France is pretty good. It's only about 3% or so, okay. Much less than in Britain, which is going to head for 7%. So there'll be people more likely to descend onto the streets in Britain than in France to protest about rising prices. I don't think they will, though. The British are relatively quiescent and don't go in for burning tires and unloading barrels fulls of tomatoes outside the front door of the Prime Minister, rather like they might do in France. But I don't think the British economy is in a very good state, partly because of leaving the EU, which has helped to lead to these very strong inflationary surges. I think the French economy looks in a better state actually at the moment, despite the high debt, than the British economy. And then in terms of the euro and overcoming the inflationary challenges, it's going to be a very rocky ride, because the European Central Bank is going to have to start to get ready to raise interest rates from the negative levels later this year. I think there's also an interesting question mark applied to your country, Françoise, about Christine Lagarde, who's been the head of the European Central Bank now for 2 years. As she always says to people, she's not a central banker, she's a politician and a lawyer. Will she stay there, or will she go back if Mr. Macron calls her? That's going to be an interesting question, which we will see the answer to maybe in the weeks after the 2 rounds of the presidential election. I don't think it matters really too much who heads the Bank of Europe, but they are going to have to take some pretty strong and difficult decisions, because that might also exacerbate the situation in Italy. If interest rates now start to rise towards the end of the year, that could have an effect on the borrowing program of the Italian government. It could put up interest rates for Italy as a very heavily indebted nation. That would strike Italy quite hard. So there's enough uncertainties and imponderables to dwell on here, Françoise.
Do you believe that the Central Bank of Europe will increase quite dramatically the interest rate? Because it will have an impact in France as well.
No, it won't be dramatic. No, they have to go very, very softly. It's far easier to cut interest rates than it is to put them up, particularly in a place like Europe where there's lots of regional disparities. So they'll have to go very, very softly. Whatever the Germans would like to do, Germany is no longer in command. That's the whole point of monetary union. There's now 19 countries that all have a say in all this. So it's going to be pretty slow.
So it will be what, 2%? Something like go up to 1.5, 2%?
Well, a lot of central bankers would be very pleased if the medium-term interest rate on government bonds, say, went up to 1.5 to 2%. That would be a much better state of affairs and would signal a certain normality compared with the negative rates we have on German bonds, or we have had until quite recently. So that would be a kind of nirvana of normality if interest rates did go up to that area in the next 2 or 3 years. That would be a sign that we have got back to normal. I think the chances that that will happen are probably less than about 30%. I think it's more likely that we're going to have pretty low interest rates for the next 2 or 3 years, partly because of the worries about whether Italy could afford it if interest rates went up much beyond the current levels.
And what about UK? What about in UK?
Well, interest rates are rising more quickly in the UK because the inflation problem is much more severe, and that's going to cause hardship as well, also for house owners. There's going to be a problem of wage pressure in the UK when you see that prices in shops and restaurants are going up by sometimes 8 or 9 or 10% a year. Then ordinary people on pretty low incomes clearly do want a pay increase. So when the governor of the Bank of England recently said, don't worry, everybody, inflation is going to come down, don't ask for more pay increases, he was clearly talking a lot of nonsense. He's also on £500,000 himself, Mr. Bailey. Clearly people will put in for higher wage increases, and there will be some labour market pressure and some problems in some industries. There will be a return of trade union activism, I think, in certain industries in the UK. So it's going to be a fairly hot year for wages, I would say, in Britain.
And the impact of the exchange between France and UK, what do you foresee considering this situation, this context?
Well, in terms of trade, there's clearly been an enormous fall in the British trade with the continent in general because of all the red tape that has to be introduced. There's a new minister called Jacob Rees-Mogg, who is supposed to be the minister looking at opportunities for British trade with other countries as a result of leaving the European Union. Good luck to him if he can spot any great opportunities there. I'm sure you at the Franco-British Chamber of Commerce are doing your best too. I would like to think that there will be some more dynamism unleashed as a result of Britain leaving the EU, and there will be some more opportunities. But when there's so much bureaucracy in the trade, in both directions, it's going to be very, very difficult for ordinary people trying to make a living, particularly smaller businesses, let's say in the food sector, when there's all these different controls that need to be brought in. It's going to be extremely difficult. And my heart goes out to the manufacturers of British cheese, for example, who are trying to export to France. That's become even more difficult in the last 2 years for the reasons you know about. And I do think those people do require the utmost of support.
And but you know, when I'm listening, when we are listening to you, so between the crisis of Ukraine, between the when we consider the crisis of Ukraine, we consider the inflation rate going up, and with the institution, you know, not ready to really go fast in by increasing the interest rate. Do you think there's still room for optimism? What could be how do you foresee the growth of the economy in the next 2 or 3 years in
Well, there's still a
Europe?
catch up. There's still a catch up going on after the big fall in 2020. France and Britain have been growing at 3 to 4%, or maybe slightly more than that, over the last year, which is a good rate of growth. That's also caused unemployment to come down in both countries. So you could say that's the reason for optimism. The very fact that unemployment is now relatively low does give the trade unions a bit more power, which they will use, and good luck to them, I would say. One source of optimism would be this new fund that the European Union has launched so that countries can make use of the borrowing by the European Commission at a relatively low rate of interest to channel money into all sorts of new economic sectors, transitioning to a low carbon economy and so on. I think that is a strong focus of optimism if the European Commission can continue to play a good game in that. If Britain had been in the European Union when that was decided shortly after the COVID crisis broke out in June and July of 2020, if Britain had been in the European Union, the British probably would have stopped that. So the fact that Britain did leave the European Union and got out of the way, you could say, was a reason why David Cameron and Theresa May deserve the Légion d'honneur from the French authorities, because Britain got out of the way and allowed the rest of the continent to get on with a greater degree of unity. And the big question mark will be whether that unity can be upheld in the post-COVID years. And there I would say I'm only moderately optimistic. I think Macron being re-elected will be a good sign. He'll have to bring the Germans along with him, and that doesn't always work. So there have been these signs of dissent between France and Germany over things like nuclear power. I myself think the Germans made a colossal mistake by getting out of nuclear power, and really they should now decide to elongate again the length of the operations of the nuclear power stations as a result of the Ukraine crisis. That would be my sensible proposal for the Germans. Mr. Macron will need a lot of persuasive power to get the new three-party coalition in Berlin to do something sensible like that. Good luck to him, I would say.
So moderate in terms of optimism, but still some signs which could improve the perception in the future. I would say.
I keep going on about Macron, but his chances of winning substantially in April, I think, have increased by the crisis we have now on the eastern borders of the EU. And he'll have to use that authority that he will no doubt have also over the coalition in Germany, over Mr. Scholz. He will have to use that authority to the greatest of his degree. And I think he will be able to do that. He's clearly still a very ambitious man, and he will have another 5 years to run. And so you could say that's a cause of relative optimism.
Before, I know that we have a short time, but is there any question for the other people participating to this session? Is there some question? Please don't. No question, please? Is there any question?
Yes.
I can see Michel has got a question.
Michel.
Yeah, good morning. Don't you think it's not a European issue, but a worldwide issue, the rising price of energy with nuclear going down and difficulty to explore oil and gas? The raw materials, all sorts of raw materials are very high prices, nickel, steel, etc. And the transport, which is becoming more expensive because of national production coming back sometimes. So don't you think this is a worldwide issue and that Europe is just suffering from that too? And you think this is lasting or not? Thank you.
I think it is a worldwide issue. I think it will last. And it would be good if Europe were to pool forces even more in the area of, let's say, exploring for minerals that are going to be needed for these new technologies, these minerals which are often in fairly unstable parts of the world, rare earths and so on, or the nickel, the vanadium, wolfram, cobalt, all these minerals. I think that would be good if the Europeans were to try to explore for these minerals and exploit them together. There has to be, of course, a much bigger effort in renewable energy. Germany is good at talking about renewable energy, not very good at actually implementing it. And so Germany is in a very poor position when it comes to the energy mix. If France and the UK jointly, as the two traditional nuclear powers in the European continent, can solve or at least take steps to solving the waste problem regarding the déchets nucléaires, then that would be an enormous progress, and that would also help to bring over Germany. Germany, after all, discovered nuclear fission in 1938, so it's somewhat ironic that the Germans have been the one big nation to turn away from that. If France and the UK jointly could act on their German partners to turn the Germans back towards a country that supported the peaceful use of nuclear power, that would be a major achievement.
That would be great, because it means that, as we know, they are voisins in France, UK and France, they cannot live without each other, in fact. It's what you're more or less saying.
We've discovered that over the last 300 or 400 years, haven't we?
Yeah, exactly. Personally, I have a question about Germany. It seems that German, according to what you are saying, Germany is less powerful currently, is weaker than it used to be in the European zone, in the Eurozone.
Well, one of my theses over the years is that Germans are always more powerful than people think they are, or they're less powerful than people think they are. When people think they're weak, they're very strong, and when people think they're strong, they're actually very weak. We've seen that over the past 150 years. We certainly, Napoleon III underestimated the strength of Prussia, for example, in 1870. So people always get it wrong about Germany. Yes, they are in a fairly weak state, I would say, and the three-party coalition underlines that. And when they do have power, they don't know how to use it. They use power in a very awkward way. They've got no sense of strategy. So the Germans are like a kind of deformed giant, if I may use that comparison. And what Helmut Schmidt used to say about Germany is that they are an economic giant, but a political pygmy, is still actually true to a very great extent. And so there is this awkward mismatch of these three or perhaps four large countries, if you include Italy, all having misaligned strengths and weaknesses in Europe, Britain now outside the European Union. That all creates actually a very, very awkward mix for Europe. But Germany is clearly at the heart of all this, and the imponderables and the lack of certainty about how Germany will react to the Ukraine crisis, Nord Stream 2, for example, just underlines this this uncertainty about the reaction function of Europe's biggest economic power.
In fact, listening to what you say, the biggest challenge today is what would happen in Ukraine for the economy, the European economy, or the world economy, in fact.
That's going to affect Europe in a very big way. simply because of the interweaving financial relationships there are, not just in energy. It's going to affect the UK as well, because there's a lot of Russian money parked in London. So unraveling that mess, which could now go on for several years, and trying to navigate a new Cold War, which may well be happening now, and what will that do to the states of Central and Eastern Europe? How will that affect the Balkans? How will that affect the Baltic states, and so on? These are going to be gigantic challenges for the European Union, outside the EU's borders partly, but also countries like Hungary and Poland within the EU borders. So that's going to take an enormous amount of statecraft. And I wish that Britain was still inside the European Union. I think that would be helpful. I also wish that Britain had a somewhat more competent government. That's another issue altogether. So there's some big black marks here.
I would like to thank you for your views, and unfortunately we will have to stop this session, but it was very interesting, and I think we should have another meeting in a few months when the French election, we will have our new president, or whoever he will be, and to have and see how the Ukraine crisis is developing, and maybe we could have another. But finally, if I can, and tell me if I'm right or wrong, finally, you are not so worried about the rising inflation, that you believe that
no, I'm not. It's a sign of normality, actually.
exactly.
We have had very low inflation for the last 5 years. It's now going up. There is a danger that the central banks will react somewhat too late. I think it would be better if they reacted early and try to nip this in the bud, but it's enormously sensitive. I don't envy the central banks, what they're trying to do here. There will be wage pressure, there will be strikes, there will be wage demands in some sectors that go beyond what is justifiable, but that's going to be, in a way, a sense of returning to normality. We're certainly not going to go back to the Weimar Republic in Germany, even if they do have 5% inflation. And Germany needs to have higher inflation for a few years, I would say, to make the country a bit less competitive. The big worry would be if we have double-digit inflation in places like Poland or Hungary or Greece. That would be a big worry indeed. So there's lots of things to talk about, and I'd welcome further conversations. And also at OMFIF, we are doing a lot on the French elections. We will be having some roundtables on that. We'll be coming to Paris as well, both before and after the election. So I do hope if we can team up with the Franco-British Chamber of Commerce, we would be delighted to do that.
With great pleasure. Totally agree. In agreement with that. Just let us know when you come, and we'll do that for sure.
Well, thank you, Diana, for organising this, and we'll have a proper meeting en présence, I would hope.
Voilà, exactly. At last.
Good. Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed for your efforts and for talking to me. I've much enjoyed the conversation. It made me feel just marginally more optimistic just talking to you, Françoise.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay. Have a good day, everybody. Good.